What sucks about the Catholic Church and why you should still be Catholic. This week on the show, I am joined by Dr. Larry Chapp to talk about that exact thing. So hang on, guys. Please watch and enjoy. Hey friends, welcome back to the show. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you are listening on podcast, thank you. Leave a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. That helps push the podcast out to new listeners and expand the reaches of conversations like this one. If you're watching, thanks guys. Subscribe to our channel, follow us, leave some comments below, interact. Love to hear from you guys. We're going to have a great conversation this week. I am joined by Dr. Larry Chapp. He is a retired professor of theology, taught for 20 years at DeSales University near Allentown, Pennsylvania, and now owns and manages with his wife the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker Farm in Harveys Lake, Pennsylvania. He writes for Catholic World Report, the Catholic Register, and a number of other places. His website, I'll put links in the show notes, is Gaudium Spes 22. It's fantastic, Dr. Chapp. I am so thrilled to have you on the show. Thank you for being here. Welcome and hello.
Hello. It's always great to meet a fellow podcaster and to help you out, and actually helps me out too. It gets my name out there too. So that's great. It's great to be here. Great to be here.
Very happy to have you. And I want to thank you for your flexibility because you had a power outage and then I had a power outage. So this is our third attempt at making this work. So I appreciate your patience, good sir. And very happy to have you.
No problem. Yeah, our power went out. It seems to go out a lot lately. So
yeah, we're having work done in the house here, so I had to move a bunch of interviews and conversations, and yours is one of them. So I appreciate your flexibility. We're going to talk now. This show, Dr. Chapp, is geared towards new Catholics, non-Catholics who are looking into this crazy thing we're doing here as Catholics, and I want to kind of frame this conversation and then shut up and get out of the way for the most part, because listeners want to hear you; they don't want to hear me. And I'll frame it this way. When I was a zealous new convert about a decade ago, I wrote an article called "What Sucks About the Catholic Church." Okay. Now, the conclusion of the article was that we suck. We are all in need of daily conversion, and it's us that has to ultimately, improve. We're what's wrong. But I touched in the article on some of the things that new converts or those who are looking into the faith experience when they actually look at the on-the-ground Catholic Church, how the Catholic faith actually unfolds versus expectations and what you read on paper and what you perceive coming into the church as a convert. And I touched on things like the beauty, the truth, the goodness, those things that draw in so many converts to the Catholic faith that when you get into the Catholic Church, when you begin to actually look into it on a daily, logistical, how it's happening on the ground, those things don't always match what you expect. And so I think I want to go through those three things with you and kind of talk about, the state of the union, kind of where we're at as Catholics, how somebody looking into the church might see these things and then actually experience them. And I want to begin with truth. So, so many converts are drawn to the Catholic faith because the truth claims that the church holds. So you do your research, you find this thing called the magisterium, you're jaded after experiencing sola scriptura Christianity, you're looking for somebody who can tell you that the church that can authoritatively, explain how to live that faith out, and in a clear way that comes from the apostles, that comes from the papacy, these beautiful things that you see as a non-Catholic convert. And so many converts, or those looking into the faith, then go, yeah, but look how this is unfolding in the church. Look at how there are documents coming out of the Vatican that seem to contradict or confuse thousands of years of teaching. Look how this beautiful thing called Vatican II seemed to just conflate or confuse the waters, and these things that emerged since then have just kind of caused the church to abandon or steer away from that truth they held for so long. There's that perception, there's the beauty of the Catholic Church, the truth, and then you get into the church and go, well, wait a minute, this isn't that unified, beautiful, talking with one voice, the authority coming from the Pope and the bishops. First of all, what would you say to somebody who experiences that, who has this idea and then sees the state of the church and it looks like it's not got this beautiful magisterial authority in practice? Who begin there?
Yeah, it's in some ways I would simply caution people right up front to the fact that even a church with a strong magisterium, say, as the Catholic Church has, is certainly not going to be a church without controversies, without differences of opinion, without strong dissent, and so on. And so, if you're entering into the Catholic Church thinking you're entering into peaceful waters where everybody agrees that every word that passes from the magisterium is true, and as soon as the magisterium teaches it, we all lay down our arms and say, oh, "Hey, brother, let's all agree." No. I mean, if you have to know church history, and you begin to understand and see very quickly, magisterium is important. The magisterium creates what I like to call boundary markers. But the boundary markers are actually fairly wide. And within those boundaries, all right, of truth, there can be widespread disagreement. So that's one of the first things I would say is don't come into the church thinking you're not going to find controversy in the church, as you saw even, say, in Protestant denominations, because you will see it. However, it is true the Catholic Church teaches propositional dogmatic truths about Christ, and that's the second thing I would caution. That all truth propositions, we don't want to be modern in a sense of enlightenment based, where the truth of religion is simply about correct little nuggets and factoids of truth, as in the Enlightenment's emphasis on science and empiricism, and we can prove this and test this, or we can deduce it logically, syllogistically, and so on. This is a modern prejudice. And so if the kind of certitude you're seeking after is that kind of empirical, scientific, hard, syllogistic certitude, you're also going to be disappointed. Doctrines that the church teaches to be true are second-order realities. The primary reality is Christ. The function of the church is singular, to take Christ and transmit him down through the ages in word, in sacrament, and in doctrine. And those doctrines are true, but they are pointing to an even greater truth, the truth of Christ. So ultimately, what it is the church is preserving, protecting, and passing on, and that's what tradition means, tradutio, to hand on, is Christ. All right. And so I would say, as you enter into the church, and you're attracted to it for truth, beauty, goodness, and so on, and you are attracted to the truth of its dogmas, you're going to encounter debate and dissension and so on. Don't be troubled by that. Keep your eyes on Christ. Keep your eye on what it is that these dogmas of the faith are transmitting. And I think what you will discover is that if you are a Christologically focused person with your faith squarely on Christ, it will be rather easy for you to see the truth of what the church is teaching about Christ, that those dogmas will come alive for you. If you are simply approaching those dogmas, as an apologist would, I need to prove these dogmas, I need to make certain that, then you're going to, in a sense, think locked into these interminable debates with others that are going to undermine your faith and maybe cause you to question, if you first focus on Christ and then turn to the dogmas, I think then you will see these dogmas are true. They do express the truth of who Christ was. And then your head won't get turned away. So, now we have a Vatican that seems to want to muddy the waters a bit. And that has troubled a lot of Catholics who, once again, eyes focused on Christ, look at the traditional dogmas of the church, see those dogmas as truly expressing who Christ is, and now see a Vatican that seems really intent on making it seem a little murkier, a little more confusing. I would say that those perceptions are true. I think this papacy has muddied the waters. And all I would say to that is that the church has had all kinds of different popes in her history. So once again, if you're coming into the church and converting to the church and you're seeking truth, yes, the papacy is there. That's the rock of Peter. And when the Pope defines something infallibly, it's infallibly defined, and you can rest assured that it's true. Nevertheless, there are many, many, many things in the history of the church that popes have said and done that don't rise to this high level. So we cannot have what I call an oracular view of the papacy, like the pope is an oracle of Delphi, where, you pay your 10 shekels and the oracle will then dispense some truth or whatever. And that's kind of what the pope, in the eyes of a lot of Catholics, has become. It's like a machine you drop a quarter into and give me some papal wisdom here, and out it comes. I mean, no, it's not like that. The Pope is under Christ, and he serves Christ. He is Christ's vicar, but he is Christ's vicar. Okay, not a replacement for Christ.
Yeah.
And therefore, the Pope is not an absolute monarch. Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, pointed this out many times. He's not an absolute monarch. He doesn't have unlimited authority. The Pope could not wake up tomorrow and say, you know what, I've changed my mind. Jesus wasn't God after all. He didn't die for our sins. There is no Trinity. And say, popes can't say that. If he would say that, then the cardinals would move in and put him in a straitjacket and throw him in the Tiber, probably, like they used to. I don't know about the straitjacket, but there was the Tiber. Okay, and so I'm being a little humorous here, but to simply make a point, popes are human, and they're fallible, and they've said and done fallible things. And it's almost a testimony to the fact that the Holy Spirit is there preserving the papacy from serious error, that when the popes have taught on a high authoritative level, either infallibly or just short of infallibility at a high level, they have taught without error. And that's all the church is saying. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is the truth is there. Christ is its center. The dogmas really do express it. Popes have by and large served it well. But the quest for absolute epistemological certitude is a false one. Faith is required, and the eyes of faith are required, which is why I say you have to put on the mind of Christ, and then the faith will open up. And anyway, so that's my answer to your first question.
That's fantastic. And I think that that's definitely a misnomer, an incorrect idea that becoming Catholic means that you're going to enter a church that has none of the kinds of debates that Protestantism has. Those debates, I think, are in a framework of the Catholic Church, though, right? It's not as if, maybe this is inaccurate these days, because there are, I don't know, whiffs of schism in parts of the church, perhaps, but there is not as if, I don't agree with the Pope over here or the bishops over here, so I'm going to break off. For the most part, and of course that's then there's a caveat there, because maybe these days it's a bit more rambunctious, but for the most part, those debates are happening within the framework of the Catholic Church that all of us agree exists, versus Protestantism, where our framework is the Bible, and if we can't agree on how that's interpreted, that's when those breakaways happen. It's not the exact same thing in the Catholic Church, although maybe, my Protestant interlocutor could argue that perhaps today we're a bit more like Protestants in parts of the Catholic Church. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. The one thing that holds us and binds us together is precisely our understanding of the church as the sacramental bringing present of Christ. And the hierarchy, the teaching magisterium in the church is part of that sacramental presence. We need to remember that. The Second Vatican Council, in its dogmatic constitution on the church, right, the very first section that dealt with the church first as mystery, but then as sacrament. The church is first a sacrament that makes present in a real way the historical resurrected Christ in the here and now. He makes Christ contemporaneous to us. Therefore, the hierarchy, the magisterium, is a manifestation of that sacramental presence and serves Christ. That is what all Catholics agree to. Okay, the concept of holy orders, and now you'll find Catholics that fudge on that and say, oh, I'm not certain I believe that, but they're sort of Catholics in name only. All right. The fact is, to be a Catholic means to assent to that sacramental reality, and that the magisterium represents it. That's what holds us together. So that when we in fact disagree, and that's why in some sense the Pope is important, even if you don't believe he's infallible, like we as Americans don't believe the Supreme Court is infallible. But thank God we have a Supreme Court, because otherwise some disputes would be endlessly litigated, right? And then it gets to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court saying, "Niet, you can't do that." And everyone says, "Okay, guess we can't do that." And so, there's no civil war. We had one, but we have, and it's the same in the Catholic Church. You have all these debates and potential schisms, and then an ecumenical council meets, or the Pope says something and says, "Here's what we're going to do," and everybody says, "Well, okay." It's like there's tons and tons of people right now in the Catholic Church that think the church should ordain women, at least to the diaconate. But the Pope came out a few weeks ago and said, "No, we're not going to do that." And so the whole debate kind of died down. Everyone said, "Oh, okay, we're not going to do that." That's whereas in a Protestant denomination, you're right. They'd say, "Well, we're going to ordain women, and so we're going to go down the street and rent a new building and make our own church."
Yeah.
We were part of the Moravian Church of the Discalced Reformed Moravians from someplace or other. Now we're going to be the new Moravians of Pentecostal fervor down the road. And so, well, I'm saying this because in the town I used to live in, there was a Moravian church, and they had an argument about whether or not to have more traditional hymns or more modern prayer and praise hymns. And so the congregation voted for the more traditional hymns. So all the prayer and praise people went down the street and formed a new church. And there was all this, they were literally 5 blocks from each other, and they hated each other's guts. All right. And then eventually the new church, the prayer and praise church, stopped being a Moravian church at all. And they became some sort of free Pentecostal shimmy shank something or other, who the first Pentecostal church of West Coopersburg, something or other, and so, that's there is an inbuilt schismatic, fragmentary tendency in Protestantism. And since there is no central authority, the fragmentation principle is constantly nipping at its heels. Absolutely.
Now, what about the schismatics in the Catholic Church? Because more and more today, at least on social media, right? And this maybe is a byproduct of, I don't know, North American politics or something, right? Just the nature of the more and more kind of segmented, fragmented society as a whole. But somebody looking into the Catholic faith says, well, look at these guys over here don't think the Pope is the Pope anymore, or they're very close to not thinking that. Or the guys over here, you mentioned ordination of women. Some of these groups are very vocal and very loud and persist against what is clear Catholic teaching from, say, the Catechism or from the doctrines and dogmas of the Church. These groups look a lot like schismatic groups. Sometimes nothing's done about them. Sometimes they're just kind of left to persist. Sometimes they're corrected. What do you make of the person who's looking at the Catholic faith and seeing these sometimes very loud groups and going, well,
that's a good question. The first thing I would say is don't form your opinion on the Catholic Church based on social media. Okay, because social media has a way of amplifying the divisions. Because we all live in a balkanized world in social media. Someone says something on Facebook or Twitter /X that you don't like. What do? You block them. I don't want to hear from you anymore. So block. I mean, I do that. No. I mean, I reserve the blocking for the most obnoxious ones, okay, who get kind of personal, but still I do it. We all do it. And that does, unfortunately, lead to a kind of balkanized echo chamber thing on the internet. And so if you're like, okay, I'm going to research Catholicism, I'm interested in it, so I'm going to go online, I'm going to look at social media. Yeah, you're going to see these sede vacante traditionalists come up, SSPX types come up. And the thing that I would simply say is this: just remember that this is being amplified by social media. That the fact of the matter is that these schismatic types in the Catholic Church, the sede vacantes, are a very, very, very small minority. There's 1.3 billion Catholics in the world, and I would say there are probably 100,000 sede vacantes, or maybe 50,000 or even 10th. I don't know. The numbers are minuscule. Just minuscule. So don't let social media give you a sense that now, all that being said, there have been schisms in the church. I mean, people have picked up their marbles and said, well, we're going to go play a different game. I mean, and this goes all the way back to the early church. I mean, for example, the first 4 great councils of the church, Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, and then Chalcedon, Chalcedon kind of tied the bow on the package of the Christological dogmas that had been developed by the church beginning with Nicaea. And yet we still have non-Chalcedonian Christian churches in the world. The Coptics, for example, in Egypt are non-Chalcedon. They refuse to accept the formula of Chalcedon. They accept that Christ was divine and human, but the question is, what is the exact relationship between the divine and the human? So in other words, these are very esoteric debates. I mean, this is some theological hair splitting going on. Did Jesus have one will or two? If he had two, was he schizophrenic? What kind of person is this? Was he like two trains on parallel tracks, one nature going one way or the other? I mean, or was he like all these crazy questions. And then, so there was a bunch of people after Chalcedon said, yeah, forget it. We're going to go form our own church. Or at least we're going to preserve what we had and not accept. So point is, there's always been little miniature schisms in the church. And yet it's like, I was just out back pruning our tomato plants. And it's like a tomato plant. Every once in a while, some of the side branches do get snipped off. But the main stalk and the main fruit, it's all still there. And that's because there is a main stock, and it's because truth is emphasized. If truth weren't important, there wouldn't be a main stock. There would simply be nothing. There would be no plant at all, really, just a bunch of weeds.
That's fantastic. I appreciate the gardening analogy. I have had some fantastic guests on this show over the last 5.5 years talking about Vatican II, and this is definitely your wheelhouse as well. And I'm a big fan of Vatican II. I've got the shirt, the tattoo, the flag. I love fantastic teaching coming out of the council. But as many will find as they begin to look into the Catholic faith and begin to practice the Catholic faith, the spirit of Vatican II that still haunts the church greatly, the fruits of Vatican II, they're fantastic fruits that have come from the council, but a whole lot of shenanigans that also came from the council and things that weren't properly implemented, things that were lost, things that we ought to do that the church emphasized and never really got off the ground. What would you say to the person, again, who is, I mean, I read those documents coming into the church. I was very excited about what the church was doing going forward. And you get there and you get the guitar mass, right? And you get the kind of dumbed down liturgy, and you get the incense maybe once every quarter in the church. You get a teaching that says, hey, laity, pray the hours, pray the divine office. This is a great thing you guys can do. And you get priests doing it half-heartedly, right? Never mind the laity.
Or not at all.
Or not at all. Getting involved. It breaks my... An example of that breaks my heart is hopping in. I had a priest ask me to move his car at a conference once. I hopped in and I moved his car, and he was listening to the MP3 version of Liturgy of the Hours, and I thought, is that how he prays this? Is that how the priest prays it?
Yeah.
Right? Like you say. So never mind the ladies. Maybe the priests aren't praying it. These things that on paper looked beautiful, like Vatican II, fantastic on paper. So many things died on the cutting, died on the production floor, didn't make it to showtime, or really kind of train wrecked, right? Things that the spirit, the fruits weren't what was intended. I know that the church takes a long time to do things. That's one lesson that a lot of converts learn. What do we make of the promises, the point of Vatican II? And then again, that on the ground, here's what we get as a result.
Well, it's a complex question for sure, but I like you. I really do love the documents of the Second Vatican Council. There is tremendous and profound theology in those documents, a theology that was the fruit of an explosion of wonderful theological scholarship that we saw in the 19th and early to mid 20th centuries. One of the most prolific eras in the history of the church of theological creativity. And I'm not talking about the liberal wackos. I mean, people like Joseph Ratzinger and Henry de Lubac. And so these were Romano Guardini, Louis Bouillet, Jean Danielou. There's a whole list of names that go in. So the council is pure theological gold, if you ask me. Now, however, Even Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, admitted that in some ways the council was a theologian's council for other theologians. It was an attempt to resolve certain theological disputes between theological schools of thought, and in the process produce some wonderful theological documents. But Ratzinger said we were so attuned to getting the theology right that maybe we didn't pay enough attention to the full pastoral effects that some of this might have downstream. And I think that's exactly right. So what I like to say is the council, beautiful theology and so on. It did suffer from a double naivete. It really did amongst the council fathers. The first naivete was that I think they overestimated the internal strength, faith of the church before the council. And, outward metrics looked great. There, in the 1940s and 50s, this post-war era, an explosion of vocations, an explosion of Catholic schools, it just an explosion of Catholic numbers overall, and the social influence of the Catholic Church. So outwardly, those metrics were strong. But Joseph Ratzinger, once again, to appeal to him in 1958, as a young priest, newly ordained, wrote a very famous article in a German journal called Hochschild. It was called The New Heathenism in the Church. Now, this is 1958, before the council. And Ratzinger's already pointing out there is a deep, deep rot in the church. The internal faith life of most Catholics is becoming secularized. People are losing the eyes of, they might still be going to mass, but they don't think like Catholics. They think like modern seculars. That accounts for one of the reasons why after the council was over and the church moved into the cultural revolution of the 60s. I'm 65. I lived through the 60s. I can attest. It was a time of tremendous cultural, political, racial upheaval. The church moved into that maelstrom, and its internal faith life was not as strong as the council fathers thought that it was. That's why Catholic culture collapsed like a house of cards almost overnight, because it was just that, a house of cards. And it wasn't just Ratzinger. Theologians like Guardini, or literary figures like George Bernanos in his famous book, The Diary of a Country Priest, 1936. Already in that novel, he has the young hero priest sanctified, basically complaining about the lack of faith of his parishioners. So the second naivete then was the council fathers they overestimated the internal strength of the church. They underestimated the toxicity of modern secular culture to the faith. They had a certain post-World War II optimism about liberal democracy, about Western-style liberal democracy. They had, after all, almost every single bishop of the Second Vatican Council lived through the Second World War. Lived through it. Wojtyła, all right? Pope John Paul lived through the Second War. Ratzinger, a German, lived through the Second World War. These were men who had been through the rigors of war. And there was a sense, remember, the council opened a mere 17 years after the end of World War II. Germany and many European countries were just then beginning to finally be completely rebuilt from the war. And so there was this optimism about liberal democracy that just wasn't justified. So you had a weaker than they thought church internally, and then a more anti-Catholic culture outside of the church. And that created, and the cultural revolution of the 60s, that created a witch's brew where after the council documents get promulgated, the liberal Catholics, liberal theologians who then dominated in Catholic universities, co-opt the message of the council and turn the entire thing into this vague thing called the spirit of the council, where they say it's not important what the council actually said. What's important is the council was an event that established a dynamic of change, which we are here to complete. And so conservatives would run around saying, but here's what the council said. Here's what the council, and they said, we don't care. We don't care what the council said. It was an event. It was a dynamic. And we're riding the wave of that dynamic, baby. So you can keep quoting the documents like some silly fundamentalist. We don't care. All right. And that's kind of one of the problems I have with the current papacy is that Pope Francis, after the mighty struggles of John Paul and Benedict to rein that spirit of Vatican II in, this Pope seems to have reinvigorated that message, those people. And so Pope Francis is not a heretic. He's the real Pope. validly elected. He's the Holy Father. We should obey him in his legitimate decrees. But he has, I think, undermined the previous two papacies, and I don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that in terms of not reining in those kinds of those kind of voices, those dissenting voices, right? Because and you've written this before other places. You know, the Pope Francis, for example, will say one thing one place and kind of scold or chastise people who are seeming more liberal, and over here do something else that appears to, kind of encourage these liberal ideas. What do we make of, again, when the Vatican released this document on blessing same-sex arrangements, right? Or blessing people in same-sex arrangements, or however you want to parse that out. I had friends who were evangelicals who text me an email and said, what the heck's going on? We thought you guys were the guys who were stalwart on this issue. We thought the Catholics were the holdouts who were going to continue to emphasize this traditional view of marriage and sexuality when everyone else in the Christian world are going crazy and slowly moving towards more and more, a more modern interpretation of these ancient biblical principles. And, so those documents are released, but then there's much to do after that, but then there's no necessarily reining in of those voices that seem to be on that liberal side who are going ahead and doing things that document seems to maybe allow, but maybe not allow. And what do we make of those kinds of situations?
Yeah, I'll steel man the argument even more. The current pontificate doesn't even, it's not just that it's not reining it in, it's actually empowering it in many ways. When you give Father James Martin a Vatican position and make him a voting member of the Synod, for example, when you give Cardinal McElroy, a public dissenter from Catholic sexual morality, a cardinal's hat, passing over the Archbishop of Los Angeles for a red hat, when you make Cardinal Hollerich the Relator General of the Synod on Synodality, and he's a public dissenter from Catholic sexual morality. When you send letters of support to Sister Janine Gramick, who runs New Ways Ministry, an openly dissenting Catholic organization, you say, and the Pope's letter essentially says, you go, girl, keep going. All right. You do your thing. Yeah, we know how much you've suffered, and then other things, the destruction of the John Paul II Institute in Rome, the destruction of the Pontifical Academy for Life in Rome, the destruction in the sense they've been gutted from within. All the JP2 Benedict types have been fired summarily without academic due process and replaced with proportionalist, liberal, relativist, moral theologians and thinkers. So at some point you have to step back and say, what is going on here? Because then the Pope gives an interview and says, no, LGBTQ ideology is ideological colonization. We cannot accept that. And the document Dignitas Infinita or whatever, infinite dignity, I think that's what it's called. That document says, we can't have any of this kind of stuff. So then it turns around and just does all this other stuff. So there's this dichotomy. All I can say is this: once again, none of what the Pope has done, let me back up 1 second. This is why, if you are thinking of converting to the Catholic faith right now, you're actually converting at a very good time, because anyone that would convert to the Catholic faith right now, even in the midst of this turmoil that's going on about this papacy, you have your heads screwed on properly, and you have your eyes wide open. I know Catholics who converted to the faith when John Paul was Benedict, and they think, these great popes, and that's great. I'm glad that they're attracted to the church because of the glorious papacies of the previous two popes. But sometimes that can be misleading. It can lead you into this sense of we're always going to have these towering intellectual and spiritual giants as pope. No. And so right now, if you're thinking of joining the Catholic Church, and we've got a bit of what I call a clunker of a pope. He's not evil. He's not horrible. I just think he's a bad pope. All right. I actually kind of like parts of him. He's got a cheeky personality, and he's a bit vindictive, and he's very human, and he's, he can have a little temper tantrum. There's parts of him that are so much like me. I kind of like, I like this guy. All right. He's not a cardboard cutout. And yet maybe that's not best suited for being pope. But anyway, I do believe that we need to remember that nothing he has taught is heretical, and there is this muddy in the water. So I would say this to those say on the gay issue, the LGBT, I thought you guys were the last holdouts. We are. We are the last hold. Just in other words, just because there's been a certain change of regime in Rome and the current pontiff seems to favor those types, notice what his official teaching is. His official teaching is still orthodox. His official teaching is that these things remain sins. They remain sins. Who knows why he's empowered these people? Maybe he just thinks we need to lay off the gays for a while or something. Maybe we just need to back off the homosexuals for a while. Just let them have their thing. I think that's wrong-headed. It's to leave people in their sins. But we can't necessarily view all of these moves that he's made on the practical level, on the personnel level, as indicative of endorsing everything that they stand for, because I don't think he does. The fact is, the Pope cannot change these teachings of the church. He cannot. And if he tries, he's going to be deposed, right? Because these are infallible teachings of the church. And this is where, to return to that truth thing, it's so important. Unlike Protestant denominations, there are bedrock, dogmatic, non-negotiable truths that are part of the Catholic faith that can never change. Christ is divine and human. Christ died for our sins. God is a trinity of co-equal persons, and you know what I mean. All right, 3 persons, 1 God. We could argue about the co-equality until the cows come home. Well, there's different scenarios, but you get my point. And that is true in the moral dimension too. The church would never change its teaching, for example, on abortion. It's prenatal homicide. It's immoral. It's wrong. It's illegitimate. And that's why our teaching will never change on murder, on adultery, or any of this. And it's never going to change on any of the LGBTQ stuff. And by the way, the B in LGBT stands for bisexual. So I have no idea. What does it mean that we're supposed to accompany bisexuals in the church or be more inclusive towards bisexuals in the church? And the reason why I bring this up is it shows the ludicrousness of this alphabet soup approach to things. We need to be inclusive of the LGBTQ plus IA community. B, how do I be inclusive of a bisexual? How are we not being welcoming towards the bisexuals? I mean, if a man is married to a woman, but has a male lover on the side, that we need to, if they come in, hey, Father, bless my unions here, that they're going to do that? I mean, of course not. In other words, the point is, there's a lot of nomenclature being tossed out there, verbiage, that we need to look at very carefully before we use it. And I think that this Pope knows that, which is why I don't think you ever see Pope Francis change the actual official teaching. And so we can rest assured on that.
Fantastic. Oh, wonderful answer. I want to move to the beauty if we can. And one of the things, of course, that draws in so many converts to the Catholic faith is the beauty of the liturgy, the beauty of the prayer life of the church, the beauty of all kinds of aspects of practicing the Catholic faith. And again, you read on paper, or you maybe experience a mass online, or you read about the mass or whatever, and you get to a mass, you get to an actual mass at your local Catholic parish, and it's maybe similar to what you've read or heard about. Maybe there's shades of it. The prayers kind of sound the same, but again, that on the ground experience of the liturgy looks quite different. This is the Catholic Church in recent times, very recent times, is suppressing ancient forms of the liturgy that many Catholics are drawn towards for the beautiful expression of the faith. I am a diehard liturgist. I love the liturgy. When the papacies began to kind of rein in parts of the liturgy that seemed to be ancient and traditional, I thought, oh, great. Now they're going to take those bits and incorporate those into the Mass we all see in our parishes. Of course, that hasn't happened. There's been the reining in and not the development, not the incorporating of that beauty that's being reined in. So to that person, that Catholic who's like, hey, I love the liturgy, but it seems like the church is starving those of us who love the liturgy and want beautiful, reverent masses. What do you say to those people?
Yeah, there's probably no single, I think, greater issue that has torn the church apart in the past 60 years after the council than the question of liturgy, and that it stands to reason. I mean, the council itself taught that the Eucharist is the source and summit of Christian existence.
Yeah.
And that's true. And it's also the fact that the vast majority of Catholics, that their sole weekly encounter with the church is that Sunday liturgy. Most Catholics are not out there doing all kinds of other ecclesial things, and they're busy raising kids, going to work, and then, okay, time to go to Mass on Sunday. So the liturgy is very, very, very important. When the new Mass was promulgated in the early 70s, it was a radical change from what came before. Now, if you read the conciliar document, Sacrosanctum Concilium, on the liturgy, it was the very first document that the Second Vatican Council promulgated, the very first one that gives you some sense of how important the Council Fathers thought that it was. You read that document says that the church should preserve Latin in her liturgy with maybe a little more use of the vernacular in the Mass here and there. It said it should retain Gregorian chant. It should have pride of place and the music of with some new music perhaps entered in here and there. There was certainly no talk of the priest turning around to face the people. And so it's very clear. It seemed like what the Council Fathers had in mind was to take the Mass that they were used to, the so-called Tridentine liturgy, and to tweak it, to maybe add some more scriptural readings, to add a little more vernacular, to add a few more different kinds of music, perhaps, to tweak it, to make it their goal. And this is something that the Council repeated over and over again. The goal of the Council Fathers was what they called active participation. They wanted the laity to stop being spectators at Mass. And this goes to what I said earlier about there was an internal weakness in the church before the council. You might have had, thousands and thousands of people still going to Mass on any given Sunday, but were they really praying the Mass? Was the Eucharist the source and summit of their entire life and existence? Or had the Eucharist become a kind of spectator thing, where you sat in the pews? I mean, like the Eucharistic prayers people need to understand, the Eucharistic prayers were not prayed out loud by the priest. The priest had his back to you. He was clear up in the sanctuary, and he was saying the Eucharistic prayers silently to himself. Silent. That's one of the reasons why the whole tradition of the bells evolved. All right. So you could say, okay, all right, he's just consecrated the bread into the body of Christ, and up goes the elevated host, the bells ring. And so at that moment you perk up and say, okay, we're halfway home. All right. And you maybe, if you were following in your missal, then you would look down and say, okay, I missed all this Latin. Here's the Latin down here. Okay. And so there you go. So this was a problem. And it wasn't just the council that noticed. I mean, many liturgists leading up to the council were saying the liturgy it's a beautiful liturgy, but it hasn't really engendered active participation. So that was their goal. But then the actual liturgy that we got was so actively participating, so radically different, that it almost eliminated then the silent aspects of the liturgy, the contemplative aspects of the liturgy that made all that chatter grounded in Christ. So we went from a liturgy where there was so little interaction with the laity that it was possible for them to just treat it as a spectator sport, where they would sit back and pray their rosaries while the priest was doing his thing. We went from that to a liturgy of banging tambourines and guitars and liturgical dance and everybody shaking everybody's hand and everybody talking and chattering and talking, and the priest is facing you, and now he's saying, hey, I'm Father Skippy Toes, let's all hold hands today, and it's just like, well, I'm not making this up. No. Oh my goodness. You go to Mass and the priest says, let's all start by introducing ourselves to one another. And so you turn to hi, my name is Larry. Apparently I love you. And so on, and you don't, it's like forced, it's contrived. Yeah. It's forced, contrived. It's ersatz, and it's kitsch. And that wasn't lost on people. So this is how they misinterpreted the council calling for active participation. They interpreted that it's like this frenetic talk, and to turn it into a slideshow. And the priest is a kind of entertainer. That then robbed the liturgy of its internal contemplative dimension. Now, I'm not saying this in order to criticize the Novus Ordo, the new Mass, because the new Mass can be done properly. It can be done reverently, with silence, with good music, with the supernatural emphasized and so forth. But this is where it's linked up with that Spirit of Vatican II crowd. What we actually got in most parishes was a clown show liturgy. And literally there were clown masses were the rage when I was in seminary in the late 70s and 80s. Some of us were trained, not me, but some of the seminarians asked to be trained to do clown liturgies where the priest dressed up like a clown, because we're supposed to be fools for Christ. The theology is we're supposed to be fools for Christ. And what's a bigger fool than a clown? And so to emphasize this, they were called clown masses. They existed. Go to YouTube, look them up. They might even still exist here and there, So that's what we got. And that's a shame. So yeah, when Pope Benedict issued Summorum Pontificum and brought back the old Latin Mass and its liberal use, I think his hope was that the new liturgy would, in a sense, cross-fertilize with the old liturgy, and they would scratch each other's backs, and the old liturgy would pick up some good habits from the new liturgy and vice versa, and the church could then organically move into a kind of reform of the Reformed liturgy. Well, that never happened, and Pope Francis has now reversed all that. And so here we are, right back in the same old liturgy. Whereas I like to say, instead of having a synod on synodality or a synod on the Amazon, why don't we have a synod on the liturgy? Yeah. The single greatest, most contentious issue in the church today, probably. All right, let's and have all voices heard, as the Pope likes to say, todos in Spanish. Everyone. Have the traditionalists there. Have the clown mouse freaks there. All right. Here comes everybody. Let's have some parrhesia, openness. Let's have it out. And at the end of the day, let's figure out what we're going to do with this liturgy.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mentioned before, as a liturgist, my first experience, and this is kind of what got me thinking about this and got me really hoping against hope that there would be a reform of the liturgy. My very first Latin Mass experience as a brand new convert, there's this group of men that met in the town, beautiful old church near my house. They met, and this priest celebrated the traditional Latin Mass, and it was beautiful. I understood nothing again. None of the Latin, the bells. Like, okay, I'm paying attention now. It was great. After the Mass, we met for a social time, and a lot of these guys were great, and I know a lot of them still to today. But there were people in that crowd, Dr. Chapp, who are those on the very verge of leaving the church, this liturgy or die, right? Their ideas of Catholic ideas were these very much kind of right-wing ideas. And so when Pope Francis has moved to suppress the Latin Mass, part of me goes, yeah, you know what? There is that community wrapped up in the Latin Mass that I've seen firsthand that's sometimes kind of fringy and is really emphasizing maybe the worst parts of Catholicism that goes along with this traditional liturgy. So I understood on one hand, okay, yeah, I see a need for bringing that community back into the fold. On the other hand, you're suppressing a liturgy that has a lot to inform the new Mass with, right? My naive hope again was that would begin to happen. And like you say, there's no moves to make that happen. You can't suppress one thing and not try and incorporate what you've suppressed in for everyone to enjoy if that's the intention, right? Without doing anything. You can't just not do anything and hope that somehow informs the Novus Ordo and it becomes beautiful.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm trying to ask you is, there's on one hand that community that is very much on the fringes of the Catholic faith that love the Latin Mass. There's a need to move them back in towards the heart of the church. There's a need to bring the elements of the traditional Latin Mass into the Novus Ordo Mass to make it more reverent and beautiful. Like you said, this it's not happening.
No, it's not. And it won't happen under this papacy either. For better or for worse, this pope is not a pope of the liturgy. He doesn't seem to be all that concerned with it, other than to say what liturgies are not to be allowed. He seems perfectly content with the Novus Ordo as it stands. He seems perfectly happy with it. He doesn't seem to be making any moves to rein in the ongoing and continuing liturgical abuses that happen. So he seems content with, even though he may not approve of those abuses, he just seems rather, maybe it's a sense of futility, like, well, what can I do? This, no matter what I say, there's always going to be priests that are going to wing it and change things. So best to just let them do their thing. I don't know. Who knows why he's adopted this mentality. So we're going to have to wait, I think, for the next pope and hope that he is more open to the kinds of things that a lot of us have been saying about the need to reform the liturgy. I think the next pope will be more open, if for no other reason than for the pastoral reason of trying to end divisions, to heal wounds, to unite the clans. Okay. I just, even for example, you have a fairly liberal Cardinal Zuppi, up in I think Milan, and I've met him a few times. He was actually pastor of a church in Trastevere in Rome when I lived in Trastevere. Very nice man, but he's pretty liberal, actually. Yet he has been very, very open to the traditional Latin Mass people that want to meet in Rome, and other places. So that's what I'm talking about. One of the most vexing things about this pope is he's always talking about going to the peripheries, and accompanying people and going to the margins and smelling like the sheep, and everyone is included. And yet he seems to have a real dislike for traditional Latin Mass people. He doesn't want to listen to them. He doesn't think that they are to be accompanied. They're on the peripheries and he's happy about that. Good. Stay there. All right. Or even go further into the peripheries. That is an attitude that has to stop. And we're not going to get a great deal of traction in reforming the Reformed liturgy until that mentality is gone. So either this pope has a change of heart, or the next pope is along these lines. Now, in the meantime, what we can do is what we can do. I mean, it's not as if the pope has put the kibosh on all kinds of things. Novus Ordo liturgies can be reverently transformed. Now, you and I both know, probably, Keith, a lot of priests that want to do that. Now, the problem is, it's not just the pope. They run into sometimes resistance from their bishop. So right here in my diocese of Scranton, I know a couple of priests who asked the bishop if they could say Mass ad orientem, facing east, facing away from the people. If they could install altar rails and have people receive communion kneeling and on the tongue and so on, even if it's just for one Mass, that for those people that like that kind of a liturgy. And the bishop said, no, absolutely not ad orientem, and no, you may not put in altar rails. Then you've got another bishop, Bishop James Conley of Lincoln, Nebraska, my hometown. And I went to seminary with Jim Conley, good friend of mine. I'm going to be interviewing him soon in my podcast. He is now, as bishop, instituted a new policy that at any time, if you want to renovate the sanctuary of your church or you're building a new church, you have to build altar rails. That's the new mandate in the diocese. And of course, Lincoln is traditionally a very conservative diocese. But in other words, we need to stop this patchwork quilt of, my bishop here in Scranton saying, no way to altar rails, no way to ad orientem. I also should mention Bishop Jim Conley says Mass ad orientem himself at the cathedral. He'll do it versus populum, and like if he goes to a parish where that's the norm. But you get my point. So you've got one bishop in Lincoln doing one thing, and the bishop of Scranton doing another. And this has then further creates division. There ought to be more leadership short of papal leadership. We ought to get more leadership from the American Conference of Catholic Bishops, United States, USCCB, where those bishops come together instead of issuing documents on climate change about which they know absolutely nothing. All right, maybe they should issue a document on the liturgy about which they ostensibly know something. Okay, and yet we get policy statements about garbage they know nothing about, that are the provenance of lay people. What is proper immigration policy? What is proper economic policy? What is proper environmental policy? They don't know squat about any of that, whereas there are experts, lay Catholic experts, who do. And that is their problem. This is one of the things of Vatican II. All right, the empowering of the laity to take their skills out into the world. All right, instead we've got bishops doing it. No, bishops, You need to be dealing with the liturgy. You need to be dealing with moral theology. You need to be dealing with the dispirited lack of morale amongst your priests who don't feel supported, and so on. And this vexes me to no end, as you can tell. It gets me really exercised. And we could do things with the liturgy if we simply stopped this patchwork quilt nonsense and got to the USCCB to issue guidelines about what we can and cannot do in terms of making the liturgy more beautiful. We just had this Eucharistic revival. Yeah. That's great. I love seeing the pictures in Indianapolis, 50,000 people strong. It brought me to tears. Wish I could have been there. And yet parading the Eucharist like a gigantic Corpus Christi procession from one coast to the other, as beautiful as that was, that's a one and done deal that might create a certain fervor in some people. Okay. But what was really needed in a year of Eucharistic revival is a Eucharistic revival by way of liturgical reform. All right. And we got none of that. The Eucharistic revival is now over, and everybody's going to go back to the same liturgies in the same beige, boring parishes that they had before, under bishops without vision who refuse to let priests make it more reverent. That's the problem right there.
Well said. The last thing real quick is goodness. The last thing that draws in people to the Catholic faith. And a really quick story on this aspect. I was the RCIA director for a parish, and we, good friend, priest of mine was the pastor of that parish. We led these candidates through the process. It was wonderful. It was beautiful. They loved it. They received their sacraments. This was during the end of COVID, so it was kind of a truncated, kind of weird timeline, but it was the middle of July, and they received their sacraments and became members of the church. And the week after, our priest was charged with inappropriate behavior, eventually laicized. And these are brand new Catholics, and that's their experience of the Catholic Church, the goodness of the Catholic Church. This is an issue, of course, that's had lots of ramifications for us, for our family, for these candidates, for many people in this particular parish. We've since left and moved towns, but it was a traumatizing event, and such a terrible kind of example for us, for me personally, of that lack of goodness sometimes in the Catholic Church. Because there are scandals, every day there are scandals. I mean, there have been scandals since the dawn of the church. So perhaps we shouldn't be surprised by these. But what do we make of the church actually practicing its own faith, actually looking good and making good choices and expressing that goodness of Christ, that love, that morality, that what do we make of that? It's a person who's looking into the church and going, guys are a bunch of corrupt, like power-hungry bishops, cardinals in Rome doing whatever you want. This isn't a Christ-centered institution.
I think it differs in one place of the world to the other. In places of the world like Africa, places of Latin America, where the church is materially a poor church. It's not a wealthy church. I don't want to engage in caricatures. Africa's not some big wasteland of poverty. It isn't. It's beautiful, beautiful place with lots of thriving cities. So, but the average, African parish and so forth is probably less affluent than the average parish in Paris or New York City and so on. And so, what we're witnessing in the Western world, at least in one sense, is the result of a flabby, lazy, affluent, rich, fat, contented church. A church that is too rich and too diverted by material pleasures and material well-being. I mean, I know it sounds cliche, but it's rooted in a spiritual law as old as St. Paul. The fleshy man does not inherit the kingdom of God. All right. Yeah. And if you look at the sins that he lists, these are all kind of sins of the flesh. The lascivious man, the sexually licentious man, the homosexual, the active homosexual man. These people are not going to enter. The drunkard is not going to enter the kingdom of God. And as every great mystic and saint who is worth their salt has ever said in the history of the church, sins of the flesh are not the greatest sins that we can commit, but in some ways, they're the gateway sins that lead to many of the others, because we are material beings. And at a very young age, we learn to fulfill very basic bodily desires. And in a culture, especially, that de-emphasizes the spiritual and the supernatural, and it's a consumer culture, a culture of consumption, the accentuation of the fulfillment of our bodily desires is pronounced. Okay, we live in a pornified culture, but more than pornified culture, we live in the Big Mac culture of here. I'm like 20 pounds over. I'm trying to go on a diet, and every time I turn around, I'm seeing an ad for Burger King and McDonald's and KFC, and so this is our culture that screams at us: eat, drink, have sex, so on, and a lot of Catholics have succumbed to that. That's the problem. We're spiritually flabby. We don't pray. You mentioned before the priest who was listening to the breviary. That, what? Part of me says, okay, he's busy. At least I know too many priests who don't pray the breviary at all.
Sure.
But still, even there, it seems perfunctory. It's like, okay, I need to get this out of the way, and so I'm going to listen to it as I drive. Now, if you're so busy that you can't sit down with your physical breviary and pray it for 15 minutes, then you're too busy, even as a priest. We need to set aside time for prayer. And so what I would say to those coming into the church or thinking of coming to the church, and you read the headlines, realize that I think that across the board, when you look at the state of religion in Western society, especially in Western Europe and North America, when you look at the state of religion, forget Catholicism, think Christianity in general, think Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam. First generation immigrants to the United States, they retained their Muslim faith, their Hindu faith. By the time you're third generation, you've got trust me, I've taught them. You've got non-practicing Buddhists, non-practicing Hindus, non-practicing Muslim kids. All right. Western culture is toxic and corrosive to the faith. And this leads to the sexual scandals that we see in the Catholic Church. And I would just ask people to remember that it's an across-the-board thing. But also to remember that by all statistics we can tell, and the best statistics are, you need a guy named Philip Jenkins who teaches at Penn State, a sociologist. He says the best way is to look at insurance claims. And if you look at insurance claims for sexual abuse by clergy, Protestants are at the same level as Catholics. Sure. This is key. This is important. All right. And it's right around Catholic priests and Protestant ministers. It's right around 3 to 4%. Now that's way too high, because that means that there's like 60,000 priests in the United States. Oh my goodness, that's thousands of 2,000, 3,000, whatever, priest predators. And this is then compounded by the fact that the bishops hid this for 60 years or so. And so what you saw starting in 2002 was that every single case that had been repressed going back to, say, 1950, all exploded onto the scene at the same time. Also, the fact that one serial rapist priest could have victimized hundreds of people. So what I would say is just realize, 96% of Catholic priests that are out there are not sexual abusers, and they're in a sense suffering now too. I mean, a lot of priests. I know a lot of priests. They live under this cloud, and my heart breaks for them because they know that they live under this suspicion. So I would just say, remember that the church is human, and right now it's a Western church that's grown fat and flabby.
Yeah. That's why I follow a number of African priests on Twitter or X, and it brightens my timeline to see some priests on the ground looking very Catholic. Dr. Chapp, I appreciate your time. Maybe one last quick question, and that is, what do you say overall to the person who is looking at becoming Catholic, in spite of all the faults, the foibles, joining the church that they see to have truth, beauty, goodness, not on the ground sometimes, but it's there somewhere? Well, what do you say?
I can say this, that I have a dear friend, Paul Campbell. He's the choir director at our church, and he's a convert to the Catholic faith. From Episcopalianism. And he kind of objects to the use of the word convert. He understands why we use it. But he says, remember, the word conversio, means a complete turning around. Yeah. Now, in some cases, you might be, non-Christian at all. And it is turning around. But he says, I prefer to call myself now a fulfilled Christian.
Yeah, that's good.
A fulfilled Christian, in the sense that, I was already a Christian. Now I'm an even better Christian. In a sense that everything that is in the Protestant faith is in the Catholic faith. And then there's more. And I think what a lot of Protestants in particular are seeking after as they come into the faith is that more.
Yeah.
They understand. They know. I'm a Methodist. I know all of these Methodist brothers and sisters. They're wonderful Christians. And I love the Methodist church that I grew up in. They nurtured me. They fed me. But I want more. I want more. I want the entire buffet, right? And the Catholic Church has the whole buffet. And so you're transformed and fulfilled. It's a higher plane of existence on the sacramental level in the Catholic Church. And so, yeah, I would just say, seek that. Don't dwell on the negative. Don't dwell on the scandals and the sins. Look for the evermore. Look for that great cornucopia of beauty, truth, and goodness that the church has to offer you.
Yeah, that's great. I like your point too, that this is the best time for the convert because you're coming in at a difficult time. So you really have your head screwed on straight. I think you're absolutely right. Larry Chapp, thank you for your time. I'll put links in the show notes to your website, where you write, your podcast, where you're putting stuff out, your YouTube channel. It's awesome stuff. I really appreciate your time this week. Thanks for being here. And I want to say God bless you. You're wonderful, your family, the community there, that lovely farm. I love Catholic workers. It's dear to my heart. So thank you. And thanks for being here.
Thank you. Hey, thank you for having me on.